In an earlier video, I talked about the evolution of Prototherians, which is an antiquated word for what we now call monotremes, of which the platypus and echidna are the only surviving species. But there were other Prototherians, literal Prototherians, meaning precursors to Therians, mammals like us, and we're going to talk about those today. This chart depicts the road to monotremes as beginning with Eutheria, where we are on the other side in the clade of Theria morpha. As I said in that previous video, estimates on the molecular clock of average mutation rates indicate that these two lines diverged sometime between 220 and 185 million years ago. In other words, between the Upper Triassic and Lower Jurassic periods, when the world was dominated by dinosaurs. Not the really interesting or super enormous ones yet, though. Those are yet to come. We're only talking about the beginner set now. I'll do another video on the evolution of dinosaurs later. In fact, that'll probably be a half a dozen videos for different sets of them, as well as the whole of Archosauria and then Lepidosauria too, just for the fun of it. Right now, though, we're talking about mammals, specifically theriomorphs, which we can interpret as slowly taking the form of Therians. So let's look at some of these side branches along the way, starting with Fruitafossor. The name should not imply that it has anything to do with fruit. It's just that this fossil was found in Fruita, Colorado. Fruita produces a lot of fruit nowadays, but it's also a place to find fossils from a time when there was as yet no fruit here. And the more important part of this animal's name is fossor, which refers to its apparent ability as a digger. There are a number of traits in its teeth and skeleton, and especially its forelimbs, that are similar to anteaters, armadillos, aardvarks, pangolins, and echidnas, implying that it, too, dug its way into the burrow of colonial insects to eat them. If so, that would have likely been termite mounds, because Fruitafossor lived in the Jurassic period 150 million years ago, and there was as yet no evidence of ants, but there were termites. It's interesting that anteaters, armadillos, aardvarks, aardwolves, pangolins, and echidnas, as well as marsupial numbats, all independently evolved to fill the anteater niche, each from different ancestral origins and in mostly separate regions of the world. Even in an overlapping area like Africa, where you have aardvarks, aardwolves, and pangolins all in one place, they are not closely related. Aardvarks are Afrotherians, closer to elephants. Aardwolves are hyenas, themselves derived from something like a civet, and pangolins are something else entirely outside of that. So it's interesting how the same mode keeps evolving over and over again, independently in different groups, like how many different lineages evolved their own sort of moles, for example, or when terrestrial tetrapods returned to the sea to live like fish again. It's happened several times. Another thing that's interesting about Fruitafossor is that a 2018 study considers it to be intermediate between theriomorphs and monotremes. This is because the most basal members of any given clade are typically the most generalized, least specialized, and they share most resemblance to the basal members of their sister clade. This is to be expected in a branching evolutionary lineage. This same study also examines haramiyida, generally considered to be a sister clade of true mammals, though they are mammaliformes and thus technically mammals themselves. When we're working from fossils, there are no hard lines of division between closely related clades. Instead, the lines are wide and gray and faded. That's one of the reasons why the notion of created kinds is so absurdly indefensible. It's also why tracing these phylogenies accurately is so difficult, requiring incredibly precise analyses and occasional revision, and there are still some discrepancies here or there with alternate cladograms depending on prominent diagnostic characteristics. You have to be wary of mistakes, too. For illustrative purposes, I copy most of my cladograms from Wikipedia, but I usually have to correct them, too, because not all of their stuff is consistent, and they get some things in the wrong places. I have to check. For this video, I had to make several corrections. If we want to improve our understanding, then it must be subject to change, to correct it as necessary, because this isn't something we need to believe. It's something we're trying to figure out. And moving on to Triconodontia, this isn't just a single species, but a clade of multiple taxonomic families, all understood to be closer to Therians than to monotremes. It's a large group, too, especially considering that it is only a sister clade and does not include our ancestors. For that reason, we can't spend a lot of time going down the wrong path, but we will take a quick look. Our first stop are Amphelestids, containing two genera of Jurassic mammals that were discovered and or formally described by pioneer paleontologist Reverend William Buckland. I've recently heard a couple of creationists claiming that paleontology began suspiciously with the discovery of dinosaurs, and that all of these early scientists were maliciously motivated to undermine the biblical account of creation. But Reverend Buckland was a Christian theologian, and he was a renowned paleontologist decades before anyone had ever heard of dinosaurs. He got a hold of Spinolestes way back in 1812, but that fossil had already been awaiting recognition in someone else's collection for a half a century before then. It was so primitive that it was described as a blend of mammalian and reptilian traits. The other fossil genus, Phascolotherium, was found in England, but it too was such a primitive type mammal that it was initially mistaken for an opossum. However, another Christian paleontologist, Sir Richard Owen, recognized that it was different from and more primitive than any marsupial. Owen was essentially a creationist who did not like the idea of evolution at all. In fact, this was still 17 years before Darwin even published that theory. But Owen already knew, better than anyone else in the world at that time, that life had evidently been changing over the ages somehow, even if he couldn't explain it. So Richard Owen had the idea that God was a tinkerer who could learn from his mistakes and replace old worn-out models with new and improved ones. Moving on to Amphidontidae also takes us from Jurassic fossils to Cretaceous. There is more here than it looks, but again, it's mostly jaws and teeth, which is frustrating because we know these were all different species, but we don't know how different they were. We know almost nothing about them other than that there were a lot of different ones a long time ago. Fortunately, we have more information on Gondwanans, at least for some of them. Since most of these are known only from teeth and jaws, being their most diagnostic features, it's reassuring that when a more complete skeleton is found, that it usually matches our expectations, except for the few whose bodies look more like that of beavers or aardvarks or flying squirrels. Even then, if you find a humerus or a vertebrae, as people often do, apart from being able to tell that it's mammalian, there's no way to know what kind of mammal it came from. Only the teeth will tell you that. This surprisingly complete fossil skeleton was found in the Gobi Desert, hence the name Gondwanan. But a more interesting fossil is called Spinolestes because it was found in Spain. Unlike nearly all the other fossils we talked about today, this one isn't just fragments of jaws and teeth, but a beautifully well-preserved, nearly complete, and still articulated skeleton. It's a lithographic fossil, which is one of the best we can hope for because they can reveal a suite of biological details that mere bones alone cannot. For example, this is the earliest mammalian fossil to confirm the presence of fur. Now, plenty of earlier fossils had a number of strong indications that fur or whiskers were present, circumstantial evidence showing that this was almost certainly likely. But this is the first mammalian fossil that actually has the fur still attached to it. And it's in two forms. An undercoat of soft insulating fur dwarfed by longer, thicker, spikier hairs more like that of a hedgehog. It also retains the impression of a patch of skin with dermal scutes like what you'd find on the tail of a rat. But what I think is most interesting is that if you view this fossil under magnification, you can make out traces of the outline of pinnae, an external ear, again like those of a rat or a shrew or a possum. And the reason I find that interesting is because there are some features that can appear independently in different animal lineages, like beaks, for example, which might develop on birds or turtles or pterosaurs and non-avian dinosaurs too, as well as monotreme mammals. But external ears, pinnae, only occur on mammals, and not even all mammals. I mean, whales and manatees used to have external ears and lost them as a consequence of streamlining for a marine environment. But the platypus and the echidna evidently never had external ears. Logically, then, our common ancestor with them didn't have pinnae either. So all through our evolution, we never had external ears, and we still didn't at the point when our lineage diverged from what would become monotremes. But Spinolestes is not an ancestral clade. We didn't inherit our ears from them because we didn't descend from them. It's a Gondwanodontid, which is a subset of Triconodontia, which is a sister group to the lineage leading to us. But as none of these other fossils can provide any details on this particular feature, then all we can extrapolate is that if pinnae evolved only once, as is apparently the case, then if Gondwanodontids had it, and modern Therians had it, then the common ancestor of both Therians and Triconodonts must have had it too. So according to the phylogenetic bracket hypothesis, our type of ear must have evolved soon after our split from the monotremes. China has a lot of lithographic fossils, especially from the Liaoning province, which was the site of a volcanic ash flow in the early Cretaceous, preserving a vast area under pristine conditions. That's how we know about Jaholotans, Ionoconodon, and Leoconodon, but not Velaticotherium. Despite appearances on this cladogram, Velaticotherium is older, from the Jurassic period, and it was for a while the earliest known example of a gliding mammal. Today we have multiple species of flying squirrels and several species of aerobatic marsupials like the sugar glider, and there are colugos, also known as flying lemurs, and most closely related to primates. The difference between Velaticotherium and all of these others is that it didn't just have webbing between its legs and arms, it also had webbed fingers too, so that any use of its hands could influence its flight. Thus, if they hadn't gone extinct, they might have developed into a triconodont version of a bat. There were a few well-preserved fossils found for 2 or 3 other gliders, these in the genera of haramiyids from back in the dawn of mammals. Remember that haramiyids are practically mammals, but not true mammals since they're mammalliformes, but they're just outside of what we arbitrarily call mammalia. However, some taxonomists put haramiyida within mammalia, which doesn't make a huge amount of difference because whichever side of the fence you're leaning on, you're still in the same point of a map. Oh, but we've taken a step back. Better not get lost. Taxonomy is an expansive maze. Where were we? Ah, yes. A sister clade to Velaticotherini is Triconodontidae, which is a taxonomic family where visibly different species were widespread across North America, Europe, and Eastern Asia. Think of all the possible color patterns and behaviors that we have no way to know now. It's like if all we knew about cats were a collection of jawbones. How interesting would it be to compare a lion to a snow leopard, to a serval, to a lynx, to a cheetah? And how would we even know about all of that if all we had were jawbones? The Triconodonts were doubtless just as diverse. However, sadly, we don't know much more about them than beyond their teeth and jaws. Triconodont means 3-cone tooth, and this refers to the cheek teeth that come to 3 cones and look a bit like a dog's carnassals. And no doubt they were used for the same purpose, for shearing meat. Even in the era of the dinosaurs, there were still plenty of animals that are small enough for these badger-sized mammals to hunt. Remember that taxonomy is a puzzle that we're still trying to figure out, and there's no better demonstration of that than this group right here. Because once upon a time, all of these, Amphelestes, Amphidontids, Gobiconodontids, Velaticotheres, and so on, were all classified as Triconodonts, until it was realized that they don't quite all fit, even though they're all obviously closely related. So the scientists identified several subgroups and kept this one for those who fit the original description perfectly. The problem is that all of these together fall into a single parent clade, and someone chose to name that collective Triconodonts, which means the true Triconodonts. But logically, these are the true Triconodonts because these are the ones that fit all the criteria correctly. I know, it's confusing. Maybe they should have named the parent clade Triconodontiforms. Anyway, we're done with Triconodonts, all of them, even the true Triconodonts, and it's time to get back on the right path. Well, first we have to take another side trip through Allotheria. The first clade to look at here is Multituberculata. And this group has us jump back to the Jurassic. Instead of having 3 cones, their cheek teeth have rounded nodules called tubercles. Multituberculates have multiple tubercles. And some multituberculates are known only from jaws and teeth, others from lithographic fossils. There is some notable diversity here, but they are like the hundreds of varieties of dogs and foxes such that we still have today, in that they hadn't differentiated a whole lot yet. For the most part, at this early stage, most of them still look like possums or shrews. Actually rats, because multituberculates were more like rodents than any of the other groups we talked about today. Except that some of them didn't just use their incisors for gnawing. Some of them had cheek teeth like great shearing blades. Imagine what these things could do to your electronics, especially wiring. There were a lot of these too. Multituberculates are divided into at least 2 subsets. Plagiaulacida consists of at least 7 known families. The other subset is Symmetrodonta, which consists of at least 10 superfamilies. Remember that a superfamily is a collection of closely related families. Every taxonomic family contains multiple genera, and every genus typically holds multiple species. So there's a whole lot more here than it seems. At one point in the Cretaceous period, multituberculates were the most common form of mammal. They started in the Jurassic, lived through the Cretaceous, and even into the Eocene. So they lived with dinosaurs and also survived them, though they didn't make it very long after that, because remember that these animals were like rodents, but in the Eocene, they were real rodents to compete with, and multituberculates still laid eggs, where rodents do not. I suspect that may have been a disadvantage too. Once a mother lays her eggs, she has to stay by the nest, If there's a sudden threat, there's no time to gather those eggs before running away. And even if she could, they might be damaged. And not only are the young helpless as eggs, but there's limited space and resources in the eggs, so they have to hatch relatively quickly. And they'll still have to develop quite a bit before they're ready to go. And this leaves them and their mother vulnerable. Whereas, if the young grow inside the mother, then she doesn't have to guard a nest, and she can be instantly on the move in the event of a threat. Then when they do separate from mom, they're more developed, not as vulnerable, not for as long as they would have been otherwise. We should also look at Gondwanan. Some put this clade within Multituberculata, others as a sister group to it. They're very close either way, yet still distinct. And just as we have Afrotherians from Africa and Laurasiatherians from the northern supercontinent of North America combined with Eurasia, Gondwanatheria means the mammals from Gondwana, which is the southern supercontinent made up of South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, Antarctica, and Australia, all connected together as it was back then in the late Jurassic. Nearly all Gondwanatherians are known from isolated teeth and jaw fragments. Only a couple species have skeletal remains. And from that, we might conclude that they look a bit like groundhogs. But did they? Really? What were these animals really like? What were their behaviors and peculiarities? There is so little to go on with our conceptual limitations from our preconceived notions of what we think a superficially rodent-like mammal would look like at this size. As we've seen, they may be like moles or colugos or beavers or anteaters, but they might also be unique in ways that we'll never know if all we have are scant fossils. Now we're backing out of Allotheria and getting back onto our own path, Triconodonts. With every taxonomic generation from what we used to think of as reptilian forms, there are a number of alterations, subtle adjustments or tweaks being made to various parts of the body to improve performance and make it more mammalian. In this case, there are a number of slight modifications of the skeleton, specifically in the shoulder blades, the humerus, and the ankles, and, as always, the teeth. But this is bigger than just what shape they are. And some animals are monophodont. They have only one set of teeth, and when they lose them or they wear out, that animal may die of starvation. Most other animals, however, can replace their teeth, and some of them do it constantly, but Triconodonts usually can only do it once. Some can do it more times, but our lineage can only replace these once. We are born toothless, and then we grow an unrooted set of baby teeth, which are replaced by our adult set, which will eventually wear out and break off or fall out later in life. Wouldn't it be nice if someone could intelligently design a decently serviceable set of teeth? The next clade is Symmetrodonta, known for molars with cusps at acute angles to each other, such that the teeth look triangular when viewed from above. However, like Triconodonts, some things in this category may turn out to belong somewhere else, so we'll just move on. Our ancestral clade of Cladotheres made another important adjustment. Where most other primitive mammals had some curvature in their inner ear already, Cladotheres improved that to a 270-degree coil in their cochlear canal, which greatly improves our hearing. The next side branch is Spinolestes, but there are only a few of them, and they're only known from uniquely distinct jaws and teeth, like most of these other things. They're different from everything else we've seen so far, but surely the shapes of their teeth weren't the only thing that was unique about them. It's the same with Spinolestes. 9 individuals from that one species are only known from one skull and otherwise jaws and teeth. Now, while this clade is defined according to meticulous analyses of dental and skeletal morphology, which we can see continued in each of their descendant subsets, there are also modifications that we should expect at this stage that cannot be indicated by fossils. For example, by this point, we should expect that baby Therians should be able to latch onto their mother's nipple rather than slurping up milk from a patch of skin the way monotremes do. These mammals must have evolved teats by now. Now, let's look at the sister sets of Theria. Understand that a particular animal species generally lasts about 5 million years on average, no more than that. By then, they will have produced 2 or more different species within the same genus or family, unless they go extinct. Now, when we're looking at sexually reproductive animals, we typically define species by the biological species concept, which is only concerned with whether they can still interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Domestic dogs can still interbreed amongst themselves, and with wolves too, but not with the African painted dog, or the South American bush dog, or the Asian raccoon dog, because those are different species. With recently related, still diverging species, sometimes you can get infertile hybrids, or if they've grown too far apart genetically, the odds continue to drop until they can't produce anything viable anymore, at which point they become genetically isolated. When one original population becomes two distinct ones, where every member of one group shares traits that are not held by any member of the other group, then if they're isolated long enough that they're no longer able to interbreed anymore, then they have become two different species. However, when you're working with fossils, there's no way to know whether they're chemically interfertile, so paleontologists use the morphological species concept, which is much more difficult, as it relies on collective analyses of myriad physical proportions of every part of a fossil. And by this method, if we looked at all breeds of domestic dogs, judging them by their bones alone, then it is true that many of them would be mistaken for different species, while at the same time, the African wild dog might be considered the same species as some breeds of domestic dog. But the type of teeth that all dogs have should still show a close relationship within the same genus or at least family, even in the most extreme cases, pretty much like they are in real life. With living animals, we can compare their genome to prove how they were related, even in cases where they can no longer interbreed. We can show how foxes are all more closely related to each other than they are to dogs, but that foxes are related to dogs. All dogs and foxes are more closely related to each other than they are to bears and seals. But dogs and foxes are more closely related to bears and seals than they are to cats and hyenas, and all of them are more closely related to each other than they are to horses, and so on and on. Computerized genomic comparisons prove all of this objectively and unambiguously. Regardless whether you want to believe it or not, we got the proof. Dogs and foxes and bears and seals are biologically related, not separately created. Deal with it. But with fossil fauna, we usually don't have DNA, certainly not complete genomes. So the best we can do is the phylogenetic species concept, where we analyze everything we do have all together, comparing different fossils morphologically to determine their evolutionary relationships to each other, and if possible, confirm that genetically whenever there are living descendants for each group from which we can get and compare DNA. Without DNA, then this method isn't always exactly objective or precise, which is why there are discrepancies sometimes. Still, this method is as accurate as it is possible to get under these circumstances. Now understand that fossilization is very rare, and most of the time when an animal dies it's torn apart or swallowed, and things that are left out on the ground eventually rot or get eroded away into nothing. Maybe only 1% are buried under the right conditions to fossilize, and then usually not completely, so there's bits of bone that will be fossilized where the rest of it didn't. And then what percentage of those fossils are we lucky enough to find just laying out on the ground or in whatever holes we've dug? Teeth are the easiest things to fossilize, but in order to find a jawbone with teeth in it, there had to be a whole animal attached to that. And finding multiple jaws for the same species, multiple species in a given genus, and multiple genera in a typical family, all based on them having a particular type of teeth that match in a particular way, shows that we're not looking at one-off mutants, but that each jaw represents not just an individual animal, but a community of them, all with the same features. At the time this animal died, there must have been hundreds more like it. That's just in one generation, because there must have been older generations too, at least several generations of them at a minimum. So 1 million or more individuals could be indicated by a single tooth. That's how they identified 3 species of Spinolestes and 9 species of Paramuridae that are all known only from teeth. Speaking of teeth, our next ancestral clade, Tribosphenic, was named for having a type of molar that could cut and grind and process food like using a mortar and pestle. But then paleontologists realized that there were a bunch of different mammal groups that independently evolved their own distinct forms of Tribosphenic teeth. So do we change the name of Tribosphenic to Boreosphenida? What other criteria describes this group? Well, there's an important biological alteration that wouldn't show up in fossils, but that they must have had by now. You see, all other egg-laying tetrapods, including monotremes, the platypus and echidna, all have a cloaca, which is a single opening at the back, which is used for urination, defecation, and procreation. But according to the phylogenetic bracket hypothesis, by this stage in their evolution, they must have routed the colon and vagina into 2 separate channels. You'll understand why in a moment. Taking one last look at the side branches, we see Aegialodonta and Papotheridae, one species each, both sadly known only from isolated teeth. And finally, we come to Theria, the parent category of both Eutheria and Metatheria, more commonly known by their surviving lineage, the marsupials. Neither of these groups lay eggs. They both give birth live, and that means that their common ancestor must have two, which they could safely do now that they have a separate birth canal. Imagine the rate of disease infection if you were literally crapping kids out of a colon. However, Metatherians retain an ancestral encumbrance that we placental mammals don't have. They have a set of epipubic bones, and these offer a bit of abdominal support, especially for the pouch that the mothers carry their young in. Monotremes evidently have this type of a pouch, which implies that all the intermediates we just talked about probably did too, since fossil forms also had epipubic bones. But the downside is that these bones restrict how big the young can be. They can't be much bigger than their eggs would have been. That's why a marsupial joey comes out as a tiny, underdeveloped fetus and then has to climb into a pouch to continue its development outside the womb. At some point, shortly after our separation from Metatherians, our Eutherian ancestors lost their epipubic bones, beginning the clade of placentalia. After that, the main limitations on gestation was the elasticity of the birth canal. Thus, the young are safer, longer, because the mother can remain on the move while they develop further in the womb. Some are even born ready to run. Of course, humans are an obvious exception to that, because our brains are so big that the head would be too big. And this is one reason why women have broader hips, because to accommodate that big fat head. But if we were born with a fully developed brain, so that a child comes out of the womb and is just able to get up and walk in moments, well, then the brain would be so big that birth would be impossible, unless we are born before our brains grow, when they're still dysfunctional, which is why our young are little more than helpless larvae for the first year or so. Most kids don't even begin to generate memories until about 2 years old, and this kind of dependence requires more than the mother can do on her own. That's why we need a social structure, societal assistance, occasional babysitters, and so on, which is one reason why they say that it takes a village to raise a child. So anyway, there you have it. The difference between primitive and modern mammals and the distance from Prototherians to Therians to Eutherians to you as a Therian.